We're in a series this summer on the Ten Commandments, and this morning we look at commandment number 7. So we're moving right along here. Our text is out of Exodus chapter 20 and verse 14. Before I read the text, it's very short. Let me remind you that we are in the midst of collecting very much needed items for the Care Center in South Haven. We do this annually, and from what I can tell back there, we haven't had a really good response yet. Usually after the second or third week, we're overflowing with items. So please be sure and pick up one of these lists on the table in the foyer, and note that they are in really special need of bottles, 4-ounce or 8-ounce bottles. It says we could easily use 100 to 200 bottles each month, and we only have about 20 on hand. So there's something that you could concentrate on and buy them those bottles that they're in need of. Also constantly in need of diapers, as you can imagine. So we have 5 weeks in this month, so you have there's 3 more weeks to give toward that. So let's do our part and bless these people and the wonderful ministry that they do there every year in our community, saving hundreds of babies' lives. Exodus chapter 20, verse 14, it simply reads, "You shall not commit adultery." Now the 7th commandment, I believe, is about marriage. It forbids adultery. What I want to do this morning, really 2 simple things. And if you looked at the outline in your bulletin, you probably think, well, that's not what the outline communicates. But I'm going to only try to do 2 things this morning. And that is to answer 2 questions. I want to try to answer the what of this commandment and the why. What does Commandment 7 require of us today? What does the 7th commandment require of me? What does it require of you? And then I want to answer the question, why? Why did God include in these laws, the laws that are, as we have said, a reflection, a mirror of the moral character of God Himself? Why would He include this commandment? You shall not commit adultery. Why is committing adultery an offense to the character of God? Why did He include it in these great laws? And those are the 2 questions today. So let's jump in and we'll move right along and then celebrate the Lord's Supper this morning. Now, as we have done in the past, we've taken, first of all, the commandment and put it in its Old Testament context. We want to do that this morning with the 7th commandment. And that is, Israel knew God as the God who was faithful to His people. He was, in a sense, a husband to the bride, the husband to Israel, and God knew, or Israel knew, that God was faithful. They could go to bed at night and sleep all night, knowing God was up all night, and He would remain faithful to His people. He was, in other words, a covenant-keeping God. In fact, Israel would only know God through covenant. So that is a fundamental thing that we have to remember and keep in mind as we're trying to answer those 2 questions, the what and why of this commandment. Everything God promised Israel was tied to covenant. Everything. He promised them land, a place that they could call their own, a place where they could be free. And once again, we have to understand this commandment in the context of liberation. God wanted His people to be free and to enjoy all the benefits of liberation and what that meant to them and how it was tied to obedience to His law. So He promised them land. He promised them abundant life. He promised them that they would be fruitful in the land. That goes all the way back to the Abrahamic covenant. So here we're reminded once again that God has promised Israel posterity. When you get into the land, I'm going to make you fruitful, and you're going to have children and children and children and grandchildren and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I'm going to bless you with great posterity. These are God's promises to Israel. And the promise to Israel was both national and individual. They understood it to be both national and a personal promise to my family. Now, I mention posterity because in a very real sense, a man's future was tied to his family. You think of Israel now in basically an agrarian nation who would go into a land to harness and plant crops and raise their animals, and these families, especially the fathers, were dependent upon posterity or offspring to continue the family name and to take care of the family after he's gone. And it's not hard to understand why a typical Israelite father would want sons, so his sons could carry on the family tradition, take care of his wife and his mother, and produce more offspring. So if life was to remain humane and orderly in the land that God was to give Israel, the Israelites would have to live together in covenant themselves. They looked to God as the covenant keeper, the example of the covenant, and they themselves would learn from that and live together in covenant. So not only was the husband and wife bound in covenant, but each man was bound to his neighbor, his fellow neighbor, his fellow man in covenant. So with that summary, it's easy for us to see why we often speak of the blessings and demands of covenant. We believe that we're a covenant family here as a body, as a church. And there are blessings and demands. See, it goes both ways. I need you, you need me. The person sitting next to you needs you, and they need you. And we have blessings and demands of being in this covenant community. So it was with the nation of Israel. Now this meant when a man took another man's wife, not only was he breaking covenant with his neighbor, but he was in reality jeopardizing that man's future. He's losing his wife to another man. Where would his posterity come from? What would he do? You see how it fractures the community? How breaking covenant with another man by stealing his wife fractures the whole community aspect and covenant aspect that God has set upon his people as a holy people. So those guilty of violating the commandment were not only violating their personal covenants, they were making a mockery of God's covenant with his people. In addition, not only did covenant wreak havoc within these two families, but it would shake the whole fabric of that society. So the seventh commandment is calling each of us to be covenant keepers as we live our lives. It's a call for us as we live to be loyal, to be trustworthy, to be dependable. This is the why of the seventh commandment. This is why the seventh commandment is really about marriage. The covenant keeper is the one who holds relationships primarily his family, first of all. He holds that relationship close to his heart, keeps covenant, keeps the family together, and in the process, life remains humane and decent. But when that covenant is broken, life is shattered. The fabric of the family is crushed, and people are impacted negatively for generations to come. Now, there's the Old Testament context, and we'll jump all the way now. This will be a real dramatic jump because we're going to jump from the Old Testament context to a modern day context. And today we're living in a completely different context, a completely different world. This is truly a post-Christian society that we live in today in this country. Christians are more and more being pushed to the fringes of society because of the secularization of our culture. And if we take a stand for these truths, and I can give you examples of it this morning, where if we stand for this truth and stand for being covenant keepers, we will have to suffer for it. We will be ridiculed for our stand if we hold to what the Lord expects us to hold to. But we live in a Camelot culture that no longer values keeping promises or encouraging covenant keeping. Instead of encouraging loyalty, trustworthiness, sacrifice, dependability, our culture encourages self-assertion, casual promises. We'll keep it as long as it's convenient. We'll keep the promise as long as it's not too painful. We're a culture that encourages expansion and individualism, self-centeredness. That's our culture in just one generalization. The age of individualism has produced what sociologists call the self-maximizer. The self-maximizer. That is to say, most evaluate relationships in terms of how that person can contribute to another person's personal growth. We ask the question when we're considering relationships, what can this person offer me? How can I benefit from this person's relationships? And it's the truth. Today, when ladies or young men go looking for spouses, they're looking through that paradigm. What kind of value can this person bring into my life? I know a young man who put off marriage for 20 years because he was looking for a woman who produced a professional income so he could keep enjoying the sports that he enjoyed in his time off. That's the truth. That's the attitude in this age of the self-maximizer. Ultimately, life becomes an ongoing quest for maximum happiness. This is why the time will come, most marriages, and the statistics prove this, the time will come, most likely come, when an affair will promise more than the person is getting in his or her current relationship. So, with that said, what does the seventh commandment call us to? The seventh commandment calls us to live our lives as the servant covenant keeper, not as the self maximizer. It often means that we will be asked to deny what we want and what we seek for the better or the best of the other person. Now, why is adultery forbidden? You say, well, that's obvious, Pastor. Maybe not. Listen to this. Why is adultery forbidden? Why did God include this commandment in the list of laws that summarize His moral character? Number one, adultery is wrong because it violates the moral character of God. That God we love, we claim to love and worship. See, it violates His moral character when we violate covenant. Secondly, adultery is wrong because it breaks fidelity or faithfulness, which is the binding thread that's woven into the fabric of our society, of human life. You see, fidelity, faithfulness, it's the binding thread that keeps families together through thick and thin. Everyone is affected by adultery. The fabric of community is weakened every time a marriage breaks apart. Thirdly, sexual intimacy. Now listen to this. Adultery is forbidden because sexual intimacy is the core of the marriage relationship. It's the meaning of the metaphor, the biblical metaphor of one flesh. And Paul addresses the issue of infidelity when he writes to the Corinthian church. And what's interesting about Paul's address concerning this issue of adultery and infidelity, Paul's argument against these sins is not simply that it's degrading for us to solicitate sex from someone other than our spouse, say a prostitute. That's not his argument. Nor does he argue that it's wrong to have sex with a prostitute because they're not nice people. That's not his argument. Remember his argument? 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? That's his argument against it. That's why it's such a sin. For the two, he says, will become one flesh. It's a complete denial, a complete refraction of the word and concept of covenant and trustworthiness and faithfulness. Now let's look this morning, as we have with the other commandments, what Christ teaches concerning the seventh commandment. And once again, Christ takes us to a radical obedience. Christ blows the dust off this commandment and gives us clarity. He takes us from the mere intent of the law to the spirit of the law. He raises the standard to its spiritual conclusion, which is radical purity. Matthew chapter 5. You have heard that it said, Jesus speaking, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now he addresses here the men, but that's not to eliminate the lady who could look and look lustfully at another person. Jesus is teaching us that faithfulness, listen, faithfulness trustworthiness, covenant keeping is first an act of the heart, not merely the body. Intimacy, commitment, mutual trust are first violated in the heart. Job said, I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a girl. Job 31:1. Now, guys, and I'm speaking to men primarily here because men struggle with this, it seems, more than women. But I think those words I just read, that I've made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at another person, I think for certain that this would cover the sins that have been brought upon us by modern day technology. The pornography industry today in the United States is a $8 to $10 billion a year business. And so we have to look at it in a fresh way. We live in a new time with technology. At our fingertips, we can fall into grievous sins with our fingertips and our eyes. So we need a fresh understanding of our Lord's teaching concerning this sin. And yet, sexual immorality, perversions, seem to carry a very special, severe warning in the Scriptures. Almost every time the Apostle Paul lists sins, sexual immorality is at the top of the list. Just read through his epistles. Read through Romans chapter 1, 1 Corinthians chapter 6. There's really no such thing as safe sex outside of marriage if you read Paul. Now, let me close with some of these just remarks. I told you we wouldn't be long this morning, although the outline looks like it's a 2-hour sermon. It's really not. Let me close with these remarks. Number one, the seventh commandment is a timely reminder that Israel as a nation, the family then and the family now, the church, are bound together by covenant. The Lord said in Malachi, through Malachi, I hate divorce, says the Lord. On the other hand, Satan hates other things as well. Satan hates the family. Satan hates the church. Satan hates the truth that's being preached this morning. And he'll spare no resource to bring down the family. Husbands, wives, listen to me. That's his desire, to bring down and crush the family. If he can lead you down the path to infidelity, he wins a great victory. For as your marriage goes, so often goes the family, and so often goes the children. Secondly, the seventh commandment is a reminder that we're to be servant covenant keepers, not self-maximizers. Keep the covenant. And I've been married 40 years. My wife could stand up here and take my place and say the same thing. It's not always easy. Now, it seems for us, the longer we're married, the fewer arguments we have. It seems to me the longer we're married, the less likely we're going to break covenant. But you never know. I was reading this book several years ago, A Godward Life by John Piper. He has a little chapter in here called The Slow Fires of Misery. And yes, it's about marriage. The subtitle is Enduring the Pain of a Flawed Marriage. See, a lot of people won't do that. They won't stick it out. They won't endure the pain of a flawed marriage. because they have an easy out. But he uses in this article, this short devotional, the lives of one of our greatest presidents, Abraham Lincoln, and his wife, Mary Todd. They did not have a great marriage. It was a pain-filled marriage. But listen, Abraham Lincoln, I'm reading now. Abraham Lincoln brought debilities to his marriage with Mary Todd. He was emotionally withdrawn and prized reason over passion. She said that he was not a demonstrative man. When he felt most deeply, he expressed the least. He was absent emotionally or physically most of the time. For years before his presidency, he spent 4 months each year away from home on the judicial court. He was indulgent with the children and left their management almost entirely to Mary Todd. Now, listen. It was a pain-filled marriage. The family lines in his face and the somber countenance that we see in those black and white photos today reveal more than the stress of civil war. But the two stayed married. They kept at least that part of their vows. They embraced the pain, even if they could not or would not remove it. What was the gain? Well, only God in time will completely reveal that. But history does show us at least 2 assessments. Number one, how it was that Lincoln, when president, could work so effectively with the rampant egos who filled his administration. The long years of dealing with his tempestuous wife helped prepare Lincoln for handling the difficult people he encountered as president. In other words, a whole nation benefited from his embracing the pain. Secondly, over the slow fires of misery that he learned to keep banked and under heavy pressure deep within him, his innate qualities of patience, tolerance, forbearance, and forgiveness were tempered and refined. America can be glad that Lincoln did not run from the fires and miseries of his marriage. There were resources for healing he did not know, and short of healing, embracing the fire is better than escape. Increasingly, contemporary culture assumes the opposite. Pain-free relationships are assumed as a right. But God promises His people something better. Blessed is the man who endures trials, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those whom He loves. Would you bow your heads with me this morning? I know I haven't finished the outline in your bulletin. If you'd like to have the answers to the rest of those questions, shoot me an email this week and I'll forward a copy to you so you can have them with you. Let's take a few minutes now and prepare our hearts for this sacrament